In the autumn of 1942, an American soldier crouching in a foxhole on Guadalcanal opened a small metal tin with a key-style opener. Inside was a dense brownish block of processed meat, a handful of hardtack biscuits, and a tiny packet of instant coffee. The temperature outside exceeded 35 degrees Celsius. Insects swarmed over everything. The nearest refrigeration unit was thousands of miles away, on a ship that might not arrive for weeks. And yet, that food was safe to eat. It had been prepared months earlier in a factory in Chicago or Indianapolis, sealed in a container designed to survive ocean crossings, tropical heat, desert cold, and the rough handling of a supply chain that stretched across the entire planet. This was not an accident. It was the result of one of the most ambitious logistical operations in human history. The challenge of feeding tens of millions of soldiers on every continent, in every climate, without a single refrigerator. We often remember the Second World War through its battles, its leaders, its political turning points. But beneath the strategy maps and the speeches lay a far more fundamental problem. Armies do not fight on courage alone. They fight on calories. A single American infantry soldier required approximately 4,000 calories per day in active combat conditions, nearly double the intake of a civilian office worker. Multiply that by the roughly 16 million men and women who served in the United States Armed Forces alone, and the scale becomes staggering. By 1944, the U.S. military was shipping over 35 million meals per day to troops stationed across Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, and dozens of other theaters. The British military maintained supply lines stretching from Liverpool to Egypt, from Bombay to Burma. Yet the Soviet Union had to feed over 11 million soldiers across a front line that extended more than 2,000 kilometers. The German Wehrmacht, at its peak deployment, sustained nearly 10 million men scattered from the Atlantic Wall to the gates of Stalingrad. The question was not merely what soldiers would eat. The question was how that food could travel thousands of miles, survive weeks or months without refrigeration, withstand extreme temperatures, resist contamination, and still provide enough nutrition to keep a human being alive and fighting. The answer reshaped not only the war, but the entire future of how humanity relates to food. The problem was ancient. For as long as armies have marched, commanders have struggled to keep their soldiers fed. Napoleon's campaigns were famously constrained by supply lines. His catastrophic retreat from Moscow in 1812 killed more men through starvation and exposure than through Russian bullets. The Roman legions carried dried grain and salted meat in leather satchels. The Mongol horsemen survived on dried curd and blood drawn from their own mounts. During the American Civil War, soldiers on both sides subsisted largely on hardtack, a dense flour and water cracker baked to the consistency of stone, often so old that soldiers had to smash it with their rifle butts before eating and pick out the weevil larvae that had burrowed inside. In every military civilization had developed some form of portable nourishment, but the Second World War introduced a challenge of a scale that no previous conflict had ever approached. This was the first truly global war, fought simultaneously across 6 continents, over oceans, through deserts, jungles, and frozen tundra. Supply lines stretched from Kansas wheat fields to the beaches of Normandy, from Australian cattle stations to the muddy trails of New Guinea. The distances were unprecedented. The climatic range was extreme, and the number of mouths to feed was unlike anything the world had ever attempted to organize. But the old methods would not hold. The sheer volume of food required, the distances it needed to travel, and the hostile environments it had to survive demanded something entirely new. An industrial approach to preservation that would transform food from a perishable necessity into an engineered commodity. The oldest and most reliable weapon in that arsenal was canning. The technology had existed since the early 19th century, developed originally by Nicolas Appert in response to a prize offered by the French government during the Napoleonic Wars. Appert discovered that food sealed in airtight glass containers and heated would resist spoilage for months, though he did not understand why. Yet the science came later. Louis Pasteur's work on microbiology in the 1860s revealed that heat destroyed the bacteria responsible for decomposition. By the 1940s, canning had been refined into an industrial science operating at extraordinary scale. The principle remained straightforward: heat food to a temperature sufficient to kill all bacteria, seal it in an airtight metal container, and the contents would remain safe to eat for years. The American military built its entire field ration system around this single technology. The C-ration, introduced in 1938 and mass-produced throughout the war, consisted of 6 small cans, 3 containing a main course such as meat and beans, meat stew, or meat and hash, and 3 containing crackers, sugar, a powdered drink, and cigarettes. Each C-ration provided roughly 3,000 calories. By 1944, American factories were producing over 1 billion cans of food per year, specifically for the military. The logistics were immense. A single armored division of 15,000 men required approximately 35 tons of food per day, nearly all of it in cans. The metal itself became a strategic resource. Tin was sourced primarily from Bolivia, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, territories that fell under Japanese control early in the war, creating a preservation crisis that forced the rapid development of alternative coatings and tin-free steel alloys. The War Production Board restricted civilian use of tin so severely that American housewives were organized into collection drives, gathering used tin cans by the millions to be melted down and reformed into military containers. But canning had serious limitations. The cans were heavy. A single day's worth of C-rations weighed nearly 2.5 kilograms, and for soldiers on foot, already carrying ammunition, weapons, water, and equipment totaling up to 30 kilograms, every additional gram mattered. The taste was almost universally despised. Soldiers described C-rations as monotonous, greasy, and barely palatable. The meat component was often a compressed, gelatinous block that bore little resemblance to any recognizable cut of animal. And surveys conducted in the field revealed that soldiers who ate the same rations for more than 3 consecutive weeks experienced measurable declines in combat effectiveness, not from malnutrition, but from the psychological weight of monotony. Men began skipping meals entirely rather than face another identical tin. The military understood that morale and food were deeply connected, but in the calculus of war, preservation and caloric density outweighed flavor. Food became fuel, nothing more. This limitation drove the development of a second major preservation strategy, dehydration. Removing water from food was one of the oldest techniques in human history, practiced by indigenous peoples on every continent for thousands of years. Native American pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried bison meat, rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries, had sustained travelers and warriors across the Great Plains for centuries. And the principle behind it was exactly the same one that military scientists now sought to industrialize. Water constitutes between 70 and 95% of most fresh foods by weight. Remove it, and you reduce not only the weight, but also the volume, making transport vastly more efficient. Dried food also resists bacterial growth, because microorganisms require moisture to reproduce. American military laboratories developed spray drying technology capable of producing powdered milk, powdered eggs, and powdered coffee at enormous volume. By 1943, the United States was producing over 200 million pounds of dehydrated food annually for military use alone. Entire categories of fresh produce were transformed into lightweight packets. Dehydrated potatoes, onions, carrots, and cabbage became standard components of the military supply chain. A shipment of dehydrated potatoes weighed roughly 1/6 of the equivalent fresh potatoes, freeing critical cargo space on transport ships already stretched beyond capacity. The results were functional, but often deeply unappetizing. Soldiers nicknamed powdered eggs Yellow Death. Reconstituted potatoes had the texture of wet paste. Dehydrated cabbage, when rehydrated, produced a smell so pungent that mess cooks in the Pacific reportedly refused to prepare it indoors. But the food was safe, light, and almost indestructible. And in a war fought across 12,000 miles of ocean, those qualities mattered more than taste. The K-ration represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt to balance portability, nutrition, and preservation in a single package. Developed by physiologist Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota, the K-ration was designed as an individual daily ration light, enough for paratroopers, scouts, and mobile infantry operating far ahead of supply lines. It came in 3 boxed meals: breakfast, lunch, and dinner, each wrapped in a wax-coated cardboard container for moisture resistance. The contents relied on multiple preservation methods simultaneously. Hard biscuits replaced bread. Processed cheese was sealed in tinfoil. Chocolate bars were formulated with a deliberately high melting point, so they could survive tropical conditions without liquefying, a special formulation known as the dehydration bar, which was intentionally made to taste only slightly better than a boiled potato. The reasoning was precise. If the chocolate tasted too good, soldiers would eat it as a snack rather than saving it for the emergency it was designed for. Bouillon powder, dried fruit bars, and chewing gum filled the remaining space. A complete K-ration provided around 2,800 calories and weighed less than a kilogram. Over 105 million K-rations were produced during the war. Keyes himself followed the ration's journey from laboratory to battlefield. Owen later acknowledged that the K-ration was never intended for prolonged use, a fact the military quietly ignored, as it became the default meal for frontline troops eating nothing else for weeks at a time. Salt and smoke remained critical tools throughout the conflict, particularly for armies with less industrial capacity or longer logistical traditions. But the Japanese military relied heavily on rice preserved through careful drying and on umeboshi, intensely salted pickled plums that could last for months without any form of refrigeration. The salt concentration created an environment chemically hostile to bacterial growth, while the extreme acidity of the plum added a second biological barrier. Japanese soldiers also carried katsuobushi, thus blocks of dried and smoked bonito fish so hard they had to be shaved with a blade before being dissolved into broth. German soldiers carried Dauerbrot, a dense, dark bread baked with minimal moisture content and treated with preservatives that extended its shelf life to several months under field conditions. It was heavy, hard, and nutritionally limited, but it survived conditions that would destroy ordinary bread within days. The German military also issued Coca-Cola, a caffeinated chocolate disc laced with coffee and cola nut extract, packaged in a round red tin designed to resist crushing. It served the dual purpose of caloric supplement and stimulant, a preservation problem and a performance problem solved in one small package. Soviet forces, often fighting in conditions of extreme deprivation on the Eastern Front, relied on sukari, twice-baked bread dried to a rock-like state that could endure weeks of rough transport and still provide essential carbohydrates when soaked in water or thin broth. A Soviet soldier's daily ration in 1942 often consisted of little more than 800 grams of sukari and whatever could be foraged or captured. Survival was measured in crumbs. Chemical preservation played a quieter but essential role across every military in the conflict. Sodium benzoate, all calcium propionate, and sulfur dioxide were added to various food products to inhibit mold growth and slow bacterial reproduction. Ascorbic acid, vitamin C, was included not only for its nutritional value, but because it functions as a natural antioxidant that slows the chemical breakdown of fats and proteins. The British military, haunted by centuries of scurvy in the Royal Navy, was particularly aggressive about vitamin supplementation, adding ascorbic acid to virtually every preserved ration issued to troops overseas. Perhaps most significantly, the war accelerated the development of vacuum sealing technology. By extracting air from packaging before sealing, manufacturers dramatically slowed the oxidation process that causes fats to turn rancid and nutrients to degrade over time. This technology, refined under the relentless pressure of wartime demand, would later become the foundation of modern commercial food packaging. The same principle that keeps a bag of coffee fresh on a supermarket shelf today was first perfected to keep a soldier alive on a Pacific atoll. The reality of preservation in the field was often far more improvised than the supply chain intended. In the Pacific theater, where tropical heat and humidity accelerated spoilage at a terrifying rate, soldiers learned to bury canned rations in cool earth, submerge them in streams, or wrap them in wet cloth to create crude evaporative cooling. Jungle conditions were so hostile to food preservation that supply officers estimated the effective shelf life of any unsealed ration dropped by over 60% compared to temperate conditions. In the North African desert, where daytime temperatures could reach 50 degrees Celsius, Food left in direct sunlight became dangerously hot. Canned meat would partially cook inside its own container, all bloating the tin and sometimes bursting the seam. Soldiers adapted by eating primarily at dawn and dusk, timing their meals to the narrow windows when temperatures were survivable for both the food and the men consuming it. On the Eastern Front, the opposite problem emerged with lethal consequences. Food froze solid within hours. Bread became hard as stone. Water in canteens turned to ice. Soldiers on both sides carried rations inside their clothing, pressed against their bodies, and using the warmth of their own skin as the only available preservation mechanism. Soviet soldiers were known to sleep with bread tucked beneath their coats, because a frozen loaf left exposed overnight could crack teeth. German troops at Stalingrad, their supply lines severed, resorted to eating horses, dogs, and boiled leather belts. Preservation became irrelevant when there was nothing left to preserve. The scale of waste was staggering, despite every innovation and adaptation. The United States military estimated that up to 10% of all food shipped overseas was lost to spoilage, contamination, physical damage, or sinking during transport. In the Pacific, entire shipments of flour arrived at their destination infested with weevils. Canned goods swelled and burst in tropical heat when the factory sealing had been even marginally imperfect. Rats devoured supplies in warehouses across every theater of operations. In some Pacific Island depots, rat populations grew so large that specialized extermination units had to be deployed before the food stores could be accessed. The British Ministry of Food calculated that maintaining a single soldier in North Africa required approximately 4 times the tonnage of supplies needed for a soldier stationed in England. Not because the soldier ate more, but because the distance, climate, and logistical complexity multiplied the losses at every stage of the chain. An entire shadow industry of pest control, quality inspection, and damage assessment operated alongside the combat forces, fighting a parallel war against biology itself. What emerged from this enormous challenge was not merely a set of military solutions. The preservation systems developed during the war fundamentally transformed how civilians ate in the decades that followed. Spam, the canned pre-cooked meat produced by Hormel, next became one of the most recognizable food products of the 20th century. Over 150 million pounds were shipped to Allied forces during the war, and it subsequently became a dietary staple across Hawaii, the Philippines, South Korea, and the broader Pacific. Instant coffee, refined to its modern form for military efficiency, entered civilian kitchens and became one of the most consumed beverages on Earth. Powdered milk, dehydrated soups, processed cheese, canned vegetables, all developed or perfected under the specific pressure of keeping soldiers fed, filled the shelves of post-war supermarkets and created entirely new categories of consumer products. The very concept of convenience food was, in large part, a direct inheritance from the logistical demands of feeding armies that could not stop fighting long enough to cook a proper meal. The legacy cuts deeper than products on a shelf. The war proved something that had never been demonstrated at this scale before, that food could be engineered. It could be stripped of water, treated with chemicals, sealed in metal, shipped across oceans, stored for months, and still sustain human life on the other side. This was a profound shift in our relationship with what we eat. For thousands of years, food had been local, seasonal, and perishable. It connected communities to their land and their climate. Then a farmer in Bavaria ate differently from a fisherman in Okinawa because geography dictated the limits of preservation. The technologies forged during the Second World War severed that ancient connection permanently. Food became a commodity that could be manufactured in one hemisphere, standardized to a formula, and consumed in another without regard to distance, season, or time. We gained the ability to feed vast populations across impossible distances. We lost the intimate relationship between the plate and the soil that had defined human eating for 10,000 years. The trade-off was neither purely good nor purely bad. It was, like most things born from war, simply irreversible. The soldiers who pried open those C-ration tins in their foxholes were not thinking about the future of the global food industry. They were thinking about the next hour, the next patrol, the next morning they might not see. But every can they opened Into every packet of powdered eggs they dissolved in lukewarm water. Every piece of Dauerbrat they cracked between their teeth was a small piece of a transformation that would outlast the war itself. The technologies born from the desperate, unglamorous need to keep armies fed became the architecture of the modern food system, a system that feeds 8 billion people today, often using methods that would be immediately recognizable to a quartermaster loading crates onto a transport ship in 1940.